Hello Artcadets, welcome to my channel where learning art is fun. I'm Sarah and today I'm going to show you how we do a cloudy background for our painting of Winnie the Pooh. So if you're ready, let's go! So here's a sneaky peek at how it turned out, and here is a list of materials I used. So my aim for this painting was to create a simple illustration of Winnie the Pooh but set him on a background with some realistic clouds. And today I've decided to use the layering technique for painting clouds. If you're not sure what I mean by this, then go and check out the quick tips video from this week, which I will link up above. But before I can begin with the clouds, I first need to paint in the sky. So I've mixed up some ultramarine blue paint with water, and using a 1/2 inch flat brush I start to apply the paint, working from the top down, and I've tilted my board by putting a book underneath the top end. So in this way we can use gravity to help the paint run down rather than pool on the page or run back up. I've decided to use the wet on dry method of painting for this background since I wanted to have a lot more control over where my water and paint were going, and I wanted to keep my sketch of Winnie the Pooh nice and dry and free from paint. Another way though you can ensure your character sketch stays clean and paint free is to use masking fluid. But using this wet on dry method is a good way to practice control, and getting a flat or even wash is a good skill to learn, but it can take a bit of practice. The key to a nice even flat wash is to firstly make up as much of your watered down colour as you're going to need before starting to paint, because you don't need to have to mix up more of your paint and water when you're halfway through your painting, because this can take time. So the second important thing is to keep the line of paint you're working on wet. If it dries out, you end up with a line between stopping and starting, which you may not want. This is why it's so important to mix enough of your colour to begin with, so you can keep the edge of the paint moving and keep it wet. So to go around the outside of the balloons here, you can see I switched to a smaller round brush so I can get neatly around the illustration without going over the light pencil lines on my sketch. So you can see here how I'm keeping the edges of that paint slightly wet on either side as I go around either side of those balloons and as I move down the page. So you can see as I'm painting the left hand side here, there is a little line of wet paint on the right hand side, so that's going to stop that paint from drying on that side. And then as I go onto the right hand side, I'm keeping the same sort of line of paint on the left hand side. So you don't want it too wet that it's running down the page, you still want to have that control, but you want to have enough there so that when you're working on one side, you've got enough to keep that other side nice and wet, so that you don't get these stop and start lines that I'm talking about. And once you can get down to the bottom of the page, you can join those lines up again as you'll see just now, and then finish off all in one go. It just really gives you a bit more time to work with. So once you've reached the bottom of the page, you need to let your paper dry thoroughly before adding more paint. If you want, you can add another layer if you're worried it's not as even as you want, or you want it a slightly different shade, perhaps darker, or adding some more variation to your colour. But for this painting I'm just going to leave it as it is. So a couple of things you will notice on my background is that firstly it's not dried completely flat. There are a few blooms and blotches of paint at the top where I painted around the balloons, and I could have fixed this by going over with another layer as I said, but I decided not to as I was going to add clouds there anyway. The second thing you might notice is that my blue paint has dried with streaks of purple in it, which is rather strange, and I've not experienced that before with this paint, so I will be looking into the formula or the recipe of this particular pigment. So yeah, I've got to do a little bit of investigation about that because I wasn't expecting it, but I'm just going to let it go today because, as I said, I'm going to be adding some clouds anyway. So on to painting our main character, and I've switched to a smaller round brush again to paint the details in neatly. I think it's a size 2 brush. So being that this is a smaller area, we don't want to use too much water and risk losing control of our paint and having it run onto the blue sky. So it's good so that we don't keep it too wet. It's also less likely to dry quickly being smaller, so streaks in that are less likely due to this being a smaller area. So I'm leaving Winnie the Pooh's t-shirt and moving on to paint the balloons now to give his orange fur time to dry so we don't have problems with colours bleeding together and mixing. And again, when painting the balloons, I was careful not to use too much water and risk it running onto the sky, but whilst the paint is still wet, I'm going to use the lifting technique that I also talked about on the quick tips video. And all that is whilst the paint is still wet, I clean my brush and dry it off on some kitchen roll and then just lift some of that paint on the area that I want to slight highlight, and then I just go over and add another layer just to kind of make it even and smooth, so you don't get really harsh lines between the highlighted area and the other area, but it kind of blends in nicely. And you need to do that while it's still wet, otherwise lifting the paint can be a bit of a problem. And I've just done the same method for the blue balloon as well. So now I can go in and paint Winnie the Pooh's red t-shirt, because all those other areas are dry. So now it's time to add the clouds. And I've just added some water to the white gouache paint that I'm going to use. And I'm just literally placing that over areas that I wasn't too happy with because of the blotching that I spoke about, and also that sort of purpliness. But we can use the clouds to our benefit in that way and just cover up areas that we're not too happy with. And this layering technique is a really easy way of adding clouds. You can add as many or as few as you like, and you can sort of blend them out in the background, you can add layers, and you can add highlights on the top as well. And obviously the drier the paint, the brighter the highlights. If you wanted to blend them out underneath the cloud area, then you just add a little bit more water. So once that was all dry, it was time to remove the outline tape, and I just decided to outline the whole illustration with my black fine liner. And this just helped Winnie the Pooh to stand out, as well as filled in any gaps or rough edges around the outline. And then all that was left to do was add a small amount of coloured pencil just to add in some colour to the bottom of his feet, and you can add in some shadow underneath his t-shirt on the inside of his arms, and if you want to you can then touch up some of the areas on the balloon and anywhere else that you feel like it. So once I'd done this, I then just added some white gel pen, which again is optional, just to the top of those clouds. And then this painting was done. For today, Arcadets, I hope you've enjoyed using the layering technique to paint our cloudy background sky for Winnie the Pooh. If you have, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, comment and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you all next week. Bye!